I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. In spring of 2020, one of the first things to break during the lockdowns was the unemployment insurance system. The overload of new applicants led to massive nationwide failure of unemployment insurance websites, which are mostly run by the states. In Maryland, the failure was compounded by a schedule change in the underlying computer system used for unemployment insurance. The state office in charge decided to go ahead with the change in the middle of all that was going on in May 2020. And they adopted a system called Beacon, which is not a system used widely in the unemployment insurance world. At that time, Rachel Harris was an attorney for Maryland Legal Aid on the eastern shore of the state and dealt with hundreds of complaints about Maryland's failed system of unemployment insurance. More than 3 years later, she has left Maryland Legal Aid to start her own law practice, but still has a number of pending and follow-up cases. And the state has made progress, but has one heck of a lot more work to do. Stick around for the full story.
Sit down. Sit and stare. Not awake. Not asleep. Not aware.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C.'s post-punk rock band Gray Swift. Mike Mangiaracina on guitar and vocals, Fabrizio Cariani on guitar and backing vocals, Evan Hurd on bass, and Chris Blackburn on drums. You can find Gray Swift on their Bandcamp page, link in the show notes. In the news this week, there is a looming government shutdown, and if it happens, there will also be furloughs of hundreds of thousands of federal workers. Unless Republicans in the Congress turn around on this, the U.S. government will run out of authorized funding starting October 1st. We have seen this game of chicken play out many, many times now. The last time the federal government actually shut down was over Christmas and New Year's in 2018 and 2019, from December 22nd to January 25th. Trump was the president, and Republicans initially controlled both the House and the Senate. Democrats had refused to sign off on the continuing resolution in the Senate. The continuing resolution is a way of extending funding and appropriations. They were in a fight over Trump's demand to include $5.7 billion to build his proposed wall between the United States and Mexico. The impasse continued for over a month as the new Congress elected in November 2018 were sworn into office in January, and control of the House of Representatives shifted to the Democrats. The 35-day shutdown was the longest in U.S. history, exceeding the 21-day shutdown in 1995-96, when Bill Clinton was president and Republicans controlled the Congress. 380,000 federal employees were furloughed during the 2018-2019 shutdown, and another 420,000 worked without knowing if or when they would be paid. Many federal workers had to find other work to make ends meet, and in Montgomery County, there were special food drives and food distribution events for federal workers. In 2019, NPR reported that there were 750,000 federal workers in Montgomery County. That is hard to imagine. The county's working-age population is about that number, and many work in non-federal jobs. Still, there is no doubt that federal employees constitute a large number of Montgomery County and Washington, D.C. area residents, and a shutdown and furlough will hurt them all. If a shutdown and furloughs happen, IHP Politics will be putting out information about local resources and events supporting furloughed federal workers on the show and on our website, ihppod.org. If you know of other resources, please reach out to our assistant producer, Daniel Gallio, at ihatepolitics.daniel@gmail.com, and we will include that resource in our list. There does appear to be a degree of willful ignorance about the shutdown and furloughs in the community at this moment. But there's a lot of talk about school truancy now. County Executive Mark Elrich has brought it up. State Senator Will Smith, chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Maryland General Assembly, brought it up as well recently. And a month ago, in late August, the week before school was to reopen, MCPS released some data on the problem and a document they called an attendance action plan. The data was largely as expected. Chronically absent students, defined as 10 days or more of unexcused absences, went up from 20% in the school year 2018-19 to 27% in 2022-23. The problem is greatest and fastest growing in high schools, 27% to 35%. Middle schools went from 18% to 22%. Elementary school numbers went down from 23% to 20%. Pre-K has always had high rate of absence at 45%, and that remains steady at this point. The more interesting part in the data is that in the 2 years 2021-22 and 2022-23, farm students who receive free and reduced meals, often used as a proxy for family poverty, has expectedly higher percentages of absenteeism across all race categories. 30% for African Americans, 42% for Hispanic farms, 31% for all other farms, which is really white and Asian students. But the growth rates of absenteeism is surprisingly higher in the non-farms category than in the farms category. Hispanic non-farms absenteeism rose by 5%, while Hispanic farms absenteeism increased by less than 1%. Similarly, absenteeism among African American non-farm students grew 3%, but farm students, the number increased less than 1.5%. The growth in the absenteeism number for white and Asian students, farms and non-farms, was about 3%. It is puzzling why the increase in absenteeism among non-farm students is growing at a faster rate than farm students. I talked to a veteran teacher recently who told me that some of this has to do with families not bothering to write excuse notes since there is no real attendance policy of consequence. MCPS used to have a loss of credit policy, which meant that after a certain number of unexcused absences, a student would fail the class even if they had perfect grades. Yet the attendance action plan released by MCPS in August does not address the loss of credit policy. The plan announces the idea of attendance teams in school, with the implication that these teams jump into action when attendance seems to be a problem. Yet it's been hard to find schools where there is a defined attendance team, let alone one jumping into action. Apart from releasing a generic plan document, there also does not seem to be a visible outreach to families on the issue either. Based on talking with teachers and parents, it is clear that we and MCPS simply do not know why there is an attendance problem. The primary cause narrative is that attendance was a problem prior to the pandemic and became worse during the COVID years. Schools relaxed certain rules to be flexible, but have not yet reimposed those rules. In an interview on I Hate Politics in spring 2023, Josh Starr, the former superintendent of MCPS and now an education consultant, offered an interesting perspective on why non-farms absenteeism might be going up. If all instruction is available online and there are no consequences of not going to school, why go? It's the equivalent of many adults wanting to work from home because they can in fact do their jobs quite well without having to deal with the commute. If this is true, what we are measuring is wrong. But when put this way, many parents and educators would disagree and would, like Amazon's Jeff Bezos, insist that employees and students belong in the building. School attendance is an omnibus problem with many factors not under the control of schools or the school district. The fact that absenteeism amongst farm students is higher is an indicator that resources at home must account for something. But then, what explains the growing absence among non-farm students? We will look more closely at this issue in a future episode. But right now, we are flailing, throwing darts into the dark in the hope that somehow we will land close to the target. And there is no evidence around which a consensus can be formed. Lots of conjectures, though. MCPS's attendance plan is Exhibit 1. The investigation of the Joel Beedelman sexual harassment scandal in MCPS by the law firm of Jackson Lewis has found that key decision makers in the school district knew about but did not look into the specific nature of the complaints when Beedelman was promoted from principal of Farquhar Middle School to Paint Branch High School. Unclear who these key decision makers were, Jackson Lewis has clarified that the Board of Education, the elected governing body over the school system, did not in fact know about the allegations until June 27, 2023, when his promotion came up in front of the board. Jackson Lewis has also found that MCPS has had a long-standing problem formally investigating anonymous and informal complaints even when they have had sufficient evidence. Our Labor Day episode this year looked at the fight to raise tipped minimum wage in Washington, D.C. By law, minimum wage for tipped workers is set lower than regular minimum wage, much lower, in the expectation that tips will make up the rest. When tips do not make up the rest, the employer must do so. But this system, as we found out in the episode called The Fight for Stable Wages in DC, brings several dysfunctions. This week, Montgomery County Council member Will Joando introduced legislation which would raise the minimum wage for tipped workers in the county to $6 an hour by July 2024 and $2 every subsequent year until tipped and non-tipped minimum wage were level. I'll be back with Eastern Shore attorney Rachel Harris to talk about how the pandemic broke Maryland's unemployment insurance system. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Rachel Harris, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you.
In 2020, when we had the pandemic, you were at the scene at the breakdown of the unemployment insurance system in Maryland. What were you doing at that time?
Back in 2020, I was working in the Lower Eastern Shore office of Maryland Legal Aid, primarily assigned to handle administrative law issues, including unemployment.
And how long were you there?
I started in September of 2019, like right at Labor Day, and I left February of this past year, 2023.
Okay, so you were there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So the failure of the unemployment insurance system in Maryland was quite spectacular. From your point of view, what were the problems you were seeing?
So initially, kind of with lots of the problems that we were facing as a nation, it was simply a matter of far too many people needing unemployment insurance at the same time, and a system that was never designed to incorporate that many people instantly. So I would say the earliest days, April, late March, April, May, we were just dealing with, I hate the word unprecedented because it's been used so much, but it really was unprecedented. And at the bottom of everything in these systems are people who have to keep it running. And when you've got way, way, way too many people that need it, it just breaks. Now, in addition to that, Maryland decided to launch their new electronic system in May of 2020, just 1 month after really the onslaught of everything.
What are the problems that came up that really, made you feel that the system was just broken?
The initial one was simply no one could get through. I mean, hours and hours and hours of waiting and trying with no success. And then when the Beacon platform was actually launched, then no one could get onto Beacon. So we had major identification issues trying to get people, into their accounts. Before the security was set up, we had huge fraud issues, which I know everyone's heard a lot about. But so many people had their information stolen, and false applications were being filed, which then for the poor people who had actually had their identities stolen, good luck getting actual unemployment if you happen to be unemployed.
You say no one could get through. describe that from your perspective?
So at the time, we would have clients calling into legal aid saying, I'm trying to get into unemployment. I'm trying to get unemployment. I can't get anyone to answer the calls. The phone keeps going busy. It was just busy, busy, busy. And then they would try it first thing in the morning. And if they got through, it would ring and they would go on hold and then it would disconnect as soon as they got to the end of holding. I mean, I've had clients that told me they called over 500 times.
So when legal aid works on this kind of thing, what do they do? What do you do?
In the beginning of the pandemic, like almost the first 6 months, we collected cases. We did not have answers. We heard the same thing over and over again about people not being able to get their benefits, not being able to get through to people, being destitute, losing their houses, losing their cars. It was horrible. I mean, the despair in people's voices was just very traumatic. But after December, by January, so there were lawsuits in a ton of states. And it was kind of every state was looking at their own, like, what are we doing to get these fixed? It's now been 6 months. Maryland negotiated, I guess, a task force. It was comprised of several different people in the Department of Labor in the Division of Unemployment Insurance, who we had a lawyer and we had a staff member who was like a manager in the local office. And then there was also like a second staff member from unemployment who basically we would set up monthly phone calls. The first couple were just sort of flops until we got reassigned our own unit. Basically, once a month, I got an hour to talk to unemployment about all of our problem cases that we could not get moved. So like that giant list that we had been compiling for 6 months, I now got to start pecking away at it. And I was able to compartmentalize like this set of issues and this set of issues and this set of issues. And then he would actually, the person that was meeting with us would actually walk me through exactly what it was. Like, for instance, some of my clients would have a blank screen when they logged into Beacon. And I was like, why is the screen blank? And then I learned that that's because it's a fraud identification flag. And so they're not showing anything on the screen because they haven't been able to identify my client as legitimately, having access to their account.
Okay, so how did they fix it?
We would just send them a copy of the driver's license and their social security card via secure email. And then once they saw it, they would fix it. Now, over time, they came up with ways to accept identification. And now there's actually like one-stop job centers where you can go in and there's actually even video ways for people who are technologically able. You can verify yourself through a video messaging on your phone. They have actually made a lot of significant developments with identification. I won't say all the issues are erased, but it's much improved over the last 3 years.
What issues remain?
If you ask me what the biggest issue hands down today is with unemployment, not the last 3 years, is the fact that the Department of Labor is using computers to gather and formulate information with regard to the circumstances that surround legal issues in unemployment. So, for instance, for the process, when someone applies for unemployment, it's going to ask them a set of questions and it's going to say, why were you unemployed? What happened? Tell us more about it. And it has a bunch of questions in it. Then after you answer all the questions, they're going to go to your employer and they're going to say, why are they unemployed? And they're going to see what the employer has to say. And then someone called a claims examiner is going to look at the answers from the unemployed person and the answers from the employer, and they're going to decide, why is this person actually unemployed? Sometimes they match up and it's really easy. Sometimes the unemployed person says, oh, it was horrible. This is why I got fired. And then you talk to the employer and it's a totally different set of circumstances. So now this is where we get into the quasi judicial proceedings because the claims examiner has to sort of act as a judge and consider the answers to both parties and make a decision as to what they believe actually happened. Now, this is where the appeal process, the due process rights attach. I mean, they probably attach in other places, but this is really where you start to see the real judicial process take effect, because now you've got potentially two different sides of a story giving information, and one person has to decide what they believe, and it can have very, very expensive consequences for people. Now, prior to the pandemic, there were people who would make phone calls, and you would call somebody and you would have a conversation with them, a recorded like questioning where they would answer questions, and it would be recorded on a piece of paper so you could see what their answers were. I mean, it was a good system. Like I found that it was very easy to see what people had responded and to figure out what you were dealing with when you have an actual person having a conversation and asking follow-up questions that are natural for a person to ask. What instead is happening now is a questionnaire with drop-down boxes. Why did you leave your job? And then you get to select, but there's no other. So if you don't fall into one of their specific things that someone has decided to populate, you're left like answering questions that don't make any sense for why you actually left, because each question sets its own follow-up questions, because you do not have a human that understands the intricacies of these things.
It seems like nobody beta tested the beacon system. If you have a long-term plan for replacing a system,
it should have been
surely,
for 2 months before. You're absolutely right. And there's something about, like, Maryland is one of the only states that chose the Beacon platform. Underlying platform that is Beacon had been used for some other insurance, not unemployment insurance. I participated in this call, like a national call, maybe 6 months ago. And they broke down each state each day into different states that used different systems. And there were like 5 states originally that had used Beacon, and all the rest of the states had stopped using Beacon. Maryland was the only one left.
Oh.
Now, I mean, this was only in our group, so I have not fact checked that with other with the states or anything. But yeah, that I can tell you that in that call, they said, "Oh, well, they're not using it anymore."
You said that Maryland had, made improvements. They seem to be wanting an automated system rather than a human system.
Mm-hmm. There are plenty of things that we can use for automation, and some of them are working just fine. But the information collecting process is too important to leave to a computer at this point. If there was and what is happening as a result is that it's twofold. Number one, people who can get into Beacon without issue and see the questionnaire have limited amounts that they can answer. Now, it does populate paragraph boxes, so they can type things in. And I've learned over the years how to kind of work around the wrong questions so that you can type something into the text box, even though it doesn't actually answer the question.
Explain, please.
Okay, so let's say the question was, it says that you were reported to have voluntarily quit. Okay, now why it says that, I do not know. But it starts by saying you were reported to have voluntarily quit. Why did you quit? And then when you open up the box, that's when I say, I did not quit. I don't say that, but I would type that for my client, or as my client was telling me, I would say, I did not quit. This is what happened. And I would put that in there because I know there's a human being that's going to read the answer.
So it's refutable. I mean, yes. But people don't understand that.
Well, not only that, but some people didn't ever quit, never said they quit, but because the question says, why did you quit? They start answering as if they quit. When in actuality, when you ask them an open-ended question, it turns out they didn't quit at all. But that's only if they see it. because there's an extra very important part of this in that it is being delivered into their Beacon account with 48 hours to answer, and it doesn't notify them.
Oh.
So half of my clients, if you are not computer literate, see, Beacon, you cannot access this section from the mobile app. You can only access it from a computer. And especially the marginalized section of the poor who do not have access to regular computers are forced to either not open it, rely on a friend with incredibly sensitive information, or go to a public computer where it's certainly not secure, and now there have been a lot of improvements with utilizing the one-stop job market and everything in the last couple of years. But early on, this was a major issue. And I had several clients who had all of their information stolen and their benefits rerouted because they relied on a niece or nephew to get on the computer and set their information because they couldn't do it.
And does the state make these people whole, or they are?
I have one client. I mean, and I like that. I still, even though I left legal aid, I still have communication with a prior client who had her benefits stolen in January of 2022. It's now September 2023, and we do not have resolution yet.
Do you think the problems as they exist today require legislative or budgetary support?
Yes. There are many elements to the requirements that people follow. And in some cases, unless the legislature tells them they have to do it, they're not going to do it for whatever reason. There are some practices that they have been doing that they found worked, and they passed legislation to firm that up to make sure it continued happening. Like, for instance, I believe last year there was legislation regarding not taking more than 50% of someone's unemployment payment to cover for an overpayment. We've got huge issues with overpayments right now plaguing the system. And it all ties back to the issues with communication I told you about, because these decisions that people are making based on these faulty questionnaires, half of the time they don't even have answers in them because somebody didn't know that they were supposed to log in and provide answers. So then you've got claims examiners making decisions on partial information. They are bad decisions. The appeal process, if you get an appeal, is so bogged down. It's a little bit better now, but at one point you were waiting, we would calendar 5 months. If you filed an appeal, you had to wait 5 months to get a hearing date. Now, I mean, if you understood the unemployment is supposed to be fast because someone is receiving no money. And I mean, truly, actually, you can't even recover more than 6 months of benefits. So let's say you were to get automatically approved for unemployment, you only get 26 weeks of benefits. And their appeal process alone was taking almost the entirety of your period of unemployment to even just get a hearing to figure out if you could get benefits.
So you would be ineligible for that then?
And yeah, you don't get money once you have a decision saying you're ineligible, that decision stands. You're not getting a dime. And what will end up happening is, especially in the early days, they would pay out the money and then they would go back and look and decide, oh, wait, they weren't eligible. So then they issue a denial that's retroactive once they've already paid the money and say, you have to pay back $18,000. And if it's even worse, if they found fraud, which is its own set of issues, if they found fraud, then not only do you have to pay all of it back. Let's say they found that you committed fraud by failing to report income for 1 week. All 26 weeks are now disqualified. You have to pay them all back. And you have a 15% fraud penalty. It's not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So there's absolutely no way to get rid of this. And you cannot pay it back with unemployment insurance benefits. So if they became eligible at a later date, the fact that they have this fraud overpayment and they're account means they'll never get benefits until it's paid off.
Do you have a client like this?
I have many, many clients like this.
So what do they do? This seems like an impossible situation.
Fraud cases would take about 8 months. They had to be specially set in for a hearing because the Beacon platform, there was something wrong with it. And when a decision was coded fraud, it just would not allow them to set an appeal. They couldn't do it. And then they found a way to manually set regular unemployment fraud cases, but for some reason the PUA fraud cases couldn't be set at all the way up until I think it was March of this year. We had PUA fraud cases that were a year and a half old and had never been set for a hearing. And the only answer we would get when we would call to ask about getting set is, the system can't do it. We don't know when it will be able to do it.
Edit note: PUA stands for the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Program. That is different from the state-run regular unemployment insurance program. Both those benefits were available in Maryland using the Beacon system. And now back to Rachel Harris.
One of my very last meetings with the monthly task force before it was sunsetted, they said, we have figured out how to schedule. We found a way to schedule for the PUA fraud cases. And in the last 6 months, I've handled, I think, probably 15 or 20 fraud hearings. I have thankfully been successful in appealing every single one of them.
When you say fraud, this is not really somebody ripping people off, but a mistake in the way that they filled out the form that was interpreted as fraud by the system.
Exactly. And most of the cases, almost all of the cases, are something where they look back 2 years to, let's say, late 2020, early 21, when there was no functional use of, there was no support. And somebody would have been trying to get benefits for, let's say, 12 or 15 weeks. And then all of a sudden they they finally get a hold of somebody. And now they have to backdate, all those weeks at one time. So traditionally speaking, when you call in for unemployment, each week you call in, you report the amount of hours you worked, you give them the information, you answer all the questions, and then you get your unemployment check. And then next week you do the exact same thing. It's easy to report your hours when you're actually reporting them at the time that you worked. It is a whole different story when someone is saying, what hours did you work on November 3rd, 2021? Now, today. I mean, can you tell me? Because I have no idea what I was doing that day. Probably representing someone in unemployment, truth be told. But I mean, what ends up happening is, and the other problem with it is, each week was they wouldn't necessarily post the date. So you would click on the date, but then when it opens up, it doesn't repeat the date in the questionnaire. So then some people are like, oh, I had a few that were like, oh, well, I just thought they populated all the weeks I called in. I didn't call in on weeks that I was working. And so they're just plugging in the answers. No, I didn't work. No, I didn't work. No, I didn't work. And not realizing they're plugging them into the wrong dates. Now, I mean, they should pay attention carefully. I get that. But it's also one of those things where they also shouldn't have to be plugging in information from 2 years ago. This is the reason why we have speedy trial rights, and because our memories don't work as well 2 years later. So what they end up having to do is, I mean, if people do it the right way, they have to actually go to their employer, get their pay stubs, and just submit their pay stubs and say, please do it this way. Now, what would happen even worse sometimes is that they wouldn't have access to the screen where you can provide the information at all, and they would have to give it to someone else. So let's say they give it to an agent who's then plugging it in. Now, 2 years later, unemployment goes back. They look back in the system and they see, wait, this person was earning wages at this point. Like, they earned wages when they reported that they weren't working and they got paid for those weeks. The person doesn't even know that they got paid for those weeks, because all they know is they were unemployed for 12 weeks. And not to mention, there's some federal funds that are thrown in there too. So you can't even rely on if they said your weekly benefit amount is $297 a week, well, guess what? You're actually going to get $597 a week because there's this $300 a week federal supplement up until September 2021. So like they just get this big chunk of money and they're like, oh, good, I finally got paid. They have no idea they were paid for the wrong dates. But then when unemployment sees it, they come back and they say you committed fraud.
Okay, so the other issue is all of this self-reporting?
If you're applying at the time that like the way it's supposed to be, if you're applying when you're currently unemployed, technically speaking, unemployment, the employers are only required to report their income every so often for each quarter, and so it is possible that an employee would become unemployed and have to submit to the Department of Labor what their last day was and everything before the Department of Labor actually gets that from the employer. So when the employer submits the information and it doesn't match, that's when something is flagged to take a closer look.
But this whole system is crazy. Why have this entire set of things a former worker must do when that information is available from the employer?
So you are repeating what, especially in the case of my clients who are trying to backdate. Now, for current ones, in fairness to the Department of Labor, it would be probably too onerous to make employers report weekly how much they're paying out.
But why?
The nature of unemployment is, well, I don't know all that's required to report to the Department of Labor, but it seems to me that
there are very few employers personally writing checks. Most of it is through Paychecks or some other payroll agency. It's all electronic. The employers are verifying the hours and hitting submit. If they are submitting to the payroll system, why can't the same data be used for unemployment insurance?
That's a deeper question than I can answer, but I can tell you with regard to the back pay, a lot of my clients say that exact thing. When somebody from unemployment says, I need you to give me your earnings from March of 21, their answer is, you have my earnings. I don't know what my earnings are. Go look and see. Like,
is that a legislative fix?
I don't know. Truly, I hope that we don't have too much more backdating. And that these issues resolve to the point where we're not having to constantly backdate benefits like we have in the last 3 years. There will always be some element of it because, if there is a dispute and you end up appealing, even in the best processes, it's going to take time. But back before the pandemic, the whole process could be over in a month. And now it could take years.
Rachel Harris, thank you for taking the time. Good luck in private practice.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with lessons from my conversation with former Maryland legal aid attorney Rachel Harris about the breakdown and continuing problems in Maryland's unemployment insurance system.
Turn your head and focus on the side of stories, bodies, faces, space and air. Lines around each box lit in the light. Touch the screen and ask for more.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with former Maryland legal aid attorney Rachel Harris? It is common knowledge that Maryland's unemployment insurance system broke down at the onset of the pandemic, as it did in many other states. What is less well known is what exactly happened. why did the system fail? What about the system failed? Yes, the pandemic overwhelmed the unemployment insurance system, and eventually, after about 7 months, there were people in the Maryland state government who were able to create a response team to address the early concerns about the failures. They were able, because of that, to obviate the slew of lawsuits that hit many other states in the aftermath. That's the good news. But whoever thought it was a good idea to go through with the replacement of the system itself in the middle of a pandemic? There might have been a thought that the new system would actually resolve the capacity problems of the earlier system. But these expectations turned out to be wrong. Based on Rachel Harris's description, Beacon, the system that Maryland chose, had not been beta tested with any fidelity. Beacon was not a system designed for unemployment insurance in the first place. Not surprisingly, it could not handle the volume and introduced several new issues beginning with access. There were problems as well with subsequent verification processes, the facts of termination, monetary and legal eligibility to get benefits, and disbursements, many of which remain unresolved to this day. 3 years later, appeals are now being heard, and incredibly, all the fraud cases that were flagged by Beacon but now argued by Rachel Harris have been overturned. There really needs to be a Department of Legislative Services report on the adoption of the Beacon system. Why the choice was made? Only a handful of states adopted it, and by now most others, it seems, have also abandoned it. How Beacon functions, the current shortcomings. The urgency of fixing unemployment insurance has dissipated. Today, there are labor shortages, not long lines of unemployment benefits. But this is the kind of systemic failure that affects the long-term reputation of government itself. And fixing it then is a way to restore lost faith. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we are trying our best to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with assistance from Daniel Galileo. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C.'s post-punk rock band Gray Swift. Mike Mangiaracina on guitar and vocals. Fabrizio Cariani on guitar and backing vocals. Evan Hurd on bass. And Chris Blackburn on drums. You can find Gray Swift on their Bandcamp page. The link is in the show notes. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.